Mukantagara moved swiftly. It was never a good idea to leave the camp for long. The Sudani man had his soldiers, brave men who would die to protect him. But there were the hunters, too, and the prize on his head would feed a desperate family for 2 seasons, be they nationalists or not. The reassuring light of the fire danced crisply as he rounded the clearing. Above, the ink-blue panorama lay spread like a torn duvet, with black shards of sparse tree limbs punctuating its occasional mass. Mukantagara took the seat to the left of Abasi Adolfo. The Sudanese boy offered him a glutinous clump of caramelized banana wrapped in a waxed leaf. The militant did not care for the taste, but its hot glucose would provide sufficient sustenance until the early dawn. Their enemy did not wait, and they could not linger. 12 hours, maybe 14 at a push. This was as long as they could expect to rest before the British became aware of the location of their camp. His men were loyal, but often they would bicker and argue. Some of them wanted to stand fast and fortify. Of course, digging in would offer them military advantages, and their knowledge of their own mother country and its parched soil would help them repel the invaders. But Mukantagara knew it was an exercise in futility. It would not take long for the Allied support to mass, and then their desperate rebellion would be strewn as splinters and wilting echoes of a ghostly refute laid bare across Sudan's scorched wastes. The young man to his right removed a small animal from beneath his Kashmiri-like shawl, a fire gecko or crested newt. Abasi knocked the creature's head sharply on a stone, rendering it dead at a touch. He skewered the lizard with a stripped sprig arm, from rectum to gaping mouth, before toasting it above the embers. Flames hungrily licked at the animal's rough skin, and it began to cook. Mukantagara looked up. The sky seemed to darken with each passing stroke of moment. The others did not speak, they only listened. Dark is this night, running so endlessly stretches our lungs to bursting, and hiding forever in shadow strains our eyes whenever we have to look upon the distance. Our enemy will be here soon. It fills our days so fully that it is both our entertainment and our way of life. The other members of the resistance laughed as they eat from the kebab spindles. Drinking is the white man's folly, continued their leader, much as cards are his sleight of hand. Our pastime is defense of our serene and holy lands which the white wolf seems beset on all sides to squander from our reverence. The enemy marches toward us, but war comes quickly. Soon the captors will have darker souls bothering their rusty gate. His musings were interrupted by the sound of a large-capacity diesel engine, guttural and throaty, rattling off of stone and stump. They all knew the sound. A troop carrier. Mukantagara listened briefly. He could hear distinctly that it was an APC and a jeep close behind it. He turned to his men to gesture them to move, but they were already on their feet. 2 of them were immediately in full motion, and as they moved towards the cave, their profiles slipped in silhouette through the descending purple musk of Sudan twilight. Quickly now, the British were here. It had been raining for most of that march. The patchy, violet sky was saturated heavily most evenings, yet despite the incessant thunderstorms, it rarely offered anything more than mere fleeting glimpses to the lightning storms above. Nearby, the outer perimeter of the airfield was marked by a simple wire-link fence, and the old striped windsock was repeatedly battered by the unwavering crosswinds. The dainty frame of a de Havilland airliner swayed on its gentle approach to Croydon's lone runway. The heavy rains could be heard impacting its wooden carcass with a percussive thudding as it made determined headway through the storm. Her 6-cylinder gypsy engines sang their howling retort in the face of a steadfast and arrogant hail. She touched down with a pop and a brief screech of tired rubber before she eased a mechanical sigh. To one side of the Croydon site, a small building with a tin roof adjoined the larger north hangar. One of the 2 windows along the sidewall was broken, and the building itself was in a rather ramshackle state of repair. A vague orange light could often be seen glowing beyond the black doorframe, giving the only clue that people were still inside. A crude sign hung from the facing wall, which stated optimistically in black letters, Imperial Airways Head Office. Any would-be visitors to the building were greeted only with a narrow passageway consisting of flimsy, rotting plaster walls. The light bulbs above the corridor were bare, 40-watt lamps with no shades, and the windows and carpets lay riddled with dust and mold. The carpet itself was beyond repair and unsightly, but it didn't really matter because much of the lighting did not function correctly anyway. The precarious financial situation that Imperial Airways had found itself in meant that cost-cutting had become the company ethos. At the far end of the corridor, a door slammed shut with a definite strike. Perhaps it had been caught by the evening's bluster, which was refusing to relent. Hanging on the wall of the side office was a forlorn poster depicting an archaic and feeble Handley Page aircraft, which had been there for years. The little office glowed to the reach of a green clerk's lamp, and the wooden desk calendar was usually obscured by an assortment of newspapers. Often, atop the pile of discarded broadsheets would be a bold arrears notice or the odd court summons. The blood-red lettering of these letters had not seemed to have raised the level of their perceived significance. Times were both tough and exciting for the airline. This meant that a policy of arrogance was needed, at least in the eyes of company chairman Eric Geddes. How could anyone allow themselves to become preoccupied with insignificant operational annoyances? How, when there were new routes to pioneer, new avenues to explore, and new subsidies to be sought? Voices of middle-aged men could often be heard in the office, even this late into the evening. Sometimes it would be a heated discussion over operational policy, or even worse, financial issues. Often, though, it would just be Eric Geddes and his general manager, John Woods Humphrey, enjoying some banter over the week's achievements. On that March evening, there was another visitor. A fragile gray moth had entered the side office, too. Its antennae were pronounced and long, as if outstretched so that it may hear the conversation going about below. Geddes brushed it gently aside as he spoke with Humphrey, wondering for a moment why it had bothered to enter the room, and what cares it could possibly have for their current expansion arrangements. The cold gust down the corridor gave lift to its progress as it danced a ghostly routine around the desk lamp. That room always felt cold. It was as if the copper radiator pipes audibly swelled and crackled to the patina of disuse. Sir Eric Geddes was a well-built gentleman in his early 50s. His square jaw and chiseled features belied his age, and many commented that he had the up-and-away air of an adventurer. His trousers on this evening had broad, striped detail, and his white shirt a formal floral pattern. Many often remarked on first meeting him that the man had clearly an extrovert taste, yet he carried his unusual garb to a satisfactory conclusion. George Woods Humphrey was less lavishly attired, except for a moustache which extended beyond the margin of contemporary necessity. He was younger than Geddes, and his voice was higher in pitch and more quintessentially plucky. He always slouched from chair to desk in a manner that had annoyed Eric. In fact, a lot of things had been annoying Eric lately. Tonight he was particularly irritable. To call it a competitor is to do them an ill service. A European route was always going to be easier. What of Heston? He asked of his colleague. Humphrey was usually more upbeat. Partly it was due to the fact that Eric was the top man, and anything that went wrong meant it was he who was first in line for any boardroom thunder. Mainly, though, George saw himself as an optimistic fellow, an old-school pioneer who would use a stiff upper lip and an ill-conceived whimsy as a means of overcoming any trial. "Larger by the day," he answered. "Nearly 3,000 feet across now. By this time next year, we may find Croydon to be merely supplementary." Geddes was unconvinced. "This time next year, and we may find that there are more pressing concerns. So typical of Chamberlain to make bold these claims without a full understanding. Italy is nothing but a nation of sanctimonious farmers." Geddes turned to tug a top corner of one of the newspapers into view. The headline read, Commons United in Defense. The year just above the headline read 1939. Sudetenland has implication for Africa, Humphrey decided. It is doubtful now that anything can be agreed. It will make for a longer trip. Despite his failings, Alcock would appear to be the exception that has proved the rule. He would have got there much quicker. He had storms in Rhodesia, stuck again at Tabora, and hit sandstorms all the way to Sudan. George's enthusiasm wavered for a moment, and he sighed. At least the Royal Mail have agreed to pay in full, despite their reservations. Geddes tapped his index finger on the front of the newspapers. Chamberlain would never have done so if anyone could have predicted how far this would go. Eric was genuinely concerned, but the younger man's eyes were once more alive with optimism. It doesn't matter, Eric. His long mustache curled in unison with a complacent smile. It's too late now. Humphrey had a caddish enthusiasm. Eric could always tell when the younger man was becoming overly excited, as he would lean forward on his chair and hold both of his hands out to clasp at Geddes' forearms. Like many of George's mannerisms, it was something that irritated Geddes, and Humphrey's tone was once more becoming excitable. We have what we asked for. Geddes was a more reserved character. Too many investigative complaints and lengthy boardroom explanations. He never allowed himself to be carried away like the younger man. Cunard can keep Europe. Eric placed a handful of paperwork on the desk in front of them. The letterhead read, Shorts of Sunderland. We have Africa, he concluded solidly. A soft wind blew across the office and kissed the topmost sheets from the pile. The purchase orders were rendered astray, and both men stared at the large printed stamp across them which read, Approved. At the top left of each of the documents was a small silhouette of an aircraft and banal text at the bottom which read £1.75 million in parts of 28. It was a calm morning along the Southampton frontages. Certainly it was brisk, but the early sun permeated what little cloud there was above. It was a welcome change for a nation which at times felt as if it were permanently parked beneath an unding winter squall. The docks were busy with people. Workers and passengers spilled to and from the road opposite, and across to the pier front and its adjoining mooring. A black Chevrolet van drifted into the goods yard just off the dockside. It rattled to a stop and wobbled visibly with the prompt halt. The van driver jumped out and dashed around to the rear of the vehicle, followed by his beloved dog, a Labrador cross. He enthusiastically called to his dog and motioned for him to follow. Come on, boy. Hep. The dog jogged happily behind. The driver hastened to the rear of the Chevy and swung the heavy doors open. Inside were various packing crates full of fruit and vegetables of good quality. The driver grabbed at the foremost crate and maneuvered it onto his stronger arm. He heaved the box upwards and gripped it firmly as the Labrador jumped up to his waist to explore whatever foodstuffs the crate may contain. The man shifted his gait to avoid the jumping animal and began the short walk to the dock front. He positioned the crate in a line with other items which were waiting to be packed for sea transport. The driver looked up at the sun, which by now was beating down with considerable strength, as he placed a hand across his eyebrows to shield against the light. His gaze drifted to the ship directly in front. It was the RMS Queen Elizabeth, a frightfully large ocean liner, which sat in the general berth area near the pier with the quiet dignity of an elephant. All around her, workers busied themselves with the task of willfully handling her lading. A young lady of some 24 years walked past the man and continued on by past one of the loading planks. She was Veronica Berry, a pretty girl with short black hair. She stood out particularly in that she was one of few lone travelers at the dock. Most of the other people were in couples or work groups. She was dressed in a pink cardigan over a blue dress and wore also a mixed expression of hesitancy and awe. Veronica carried a small case under her right arm and a shoulder bag on her left. She glanced with admiration at the ocean liner before continuing her walk down the dock. Continuing from berth 21 to 22, a small naval frigate swayed to the wind's morning rhythm. Its gun emplacements and radar gave it a spiky presence, a really hard and difficult silhouette. It was a typical military olive, and an unnecessary reminder of how continued discussions regarding mainland Europe had gone from bad to worse. As Miss Barry walked past the berth and onto the next, she noticed a sign by the waterfront, which simply stated a series of destinations. It read, Naivasha, Mombasa, Kisumu, Port Bell, Juba. Such a simple icon suddenly made real the scale and grandeur of her impending voyage. The young lady took a moment to catch her breath and shifted her leather bag on her tired shoulder. She paced along the water edge beside the glittering morning sea which spanned the gap between the berths until she arrived at berth 25. Moored there was a different kind of boat. It was a flying boat, an apparition of intense, ghostly silver and powerful, refracted sunlight. The Short's aircraft bobbed delicately in the current. Its upturned nose, which formed both bow and nose cone, seemed to thumb a sign of disregard to the mere land by which it was graced. She seemed happy on the water, yet would be happier still to receive release from her dockside residence, so that she may escape its cool embrace and make skywards. It was an impossibly pretty shape, one where form met convivially with necessity, but culminated in a strange and inescapable beauty. Her nose was adorned with a simple Imperial Airways London legend and the name Corsair. Gulls chattered above. A soft wind pulled strands of Miss Barry's hair partially across her face. She moved it back into place with a gloved hand before continuing her walk towards the flying boat. West Stores was a small outfit just across the road from the pier front. The shop had been there for years. A brass bell above the front door clattered with the entrance of Mervyn Dukes. He was a handsome man in his early 30s, whose proper deportment projected an aura of subtle calm. The gentleman was well attired and carried a small brown leather diary and but one small satchel. He made his way carefully into the shop but stopped by the middle racking, which contained a typical assortment of tinned goods, cleaning products, and postcards. A particular card had caught his eye. He removed it from the rack and thumbed it thoughtfully. The image depicted the flying boat moored just across the way. Underneath the colorful illustration, the token subtext read, "He left a Corsair's name to other times." Dukes took the card to the counter where the store owner was attending to the stocking of spirit bottles behind the desk. He turned to face the man. "Good day to you. Lovely morning, isn't it?" suggested the shopkeeper. Dukes smiled politely and placed the single postcard onto the desk. The shopkeeper continued with his bland pleasantries. "Will there be anything else?" Mr. Dukes was well-spoken and slow to respond. "A smallest bottle of Elgin, if you will. Are you flying this morning?" "Yes," he replied simply. The shopkeeper looked at the postcard. "Sir may be fit to realize, but the flight to wherever it may land is never a short one. You could consider something that befits the passenger of an Empire boat." Dukes was caught off guard by the supposition. "Very well. I shall take the Macallan." The store owner removed an ornate-looking whiskey bottle from the shelf behind. "This is a good choice. The journey is always part of a reason to venture, do you not think? Land plain whiskey will not do." Dukes had never been one for small talk, but he found himself to be pleasantly surprised at the infectious enthusiasm being broadcast by the stranger. The shopkeeper looked up and smiled at Dukes, who placed the money on the counter. "I trust that you will have a good flight." "I shall," Dukes replied. "The Corsair leaves out of berth 25. Just follow the signs." "Thank you," said Dukes, now keen to press on. He took the bottle and checked to make sure he had both satchel and diary. He exited the shop and proceeded across the road, semi-mindful of passing delivery vehicles, which could always be found busying past the dock. He paced over the road towards berth 25. Across the way, more dock workers had by now surrounded the flying boat. Corsair's departure was imminent. Dukes handed a boarding card to the dockmaster waiting by the mooring, and proceeded across the little gangplank and onto the flying boat. The dockhand signaled the pilot of the plane to indicate that rudimentary checks were now complete. Dukes boarded Corsair. The inside of the flying boat was more luxury liner than aircraft. Burr walnut adorned the underside of cabin windows on this lower deck, with polished grab rails. and all around was comfortable seating arranged in 2 rows, resplendent in a good quality green cloth, more synonymous of a West End theater than an airliner. Mr. Dukes turned to assess the other passengers. The cabin was lightly peopled and reserved a fair number of free seats. Directly to the right, a slightly nervous girl with a pink cardigan over a blue dress sat with both hands in her lap. It was the girl he had noticed previously on the dock access road. Dukes turned back around to gaze at the mooring, which by now was bobbing softly away from his vantage. The morning calm was shattered by a fierce induction crackle, first to the right and then shortly after to the left. It was the sound of carburetor melding air to fuel and exhausting its first thirsty intake and discharging it at pace to a cool Southampton breeze. The sound intensified as engines either side of the primes were lit up. The hull below rocked gently to the sensation of torque overcoming inertia. Mr. Dukes mused the sound and the ensuing motion of the hull. The high-pitched whine eventually gave way to a deeper and more mellow howl as the propellers gained pace and began to cut the air with a progressive ease. The boat was turning. Miss Barry shifted uncomfortably in her seat and looked out of the starboard window across the bay. Soft waves fortified the sensation of lateral drift, and the boat still moved in a tight circle to the right. The boatmaster and pilot, John Alcock, entered the passenger compartment from the cockpit at the front of the aircraft. He was perhaps 50 and had white hair and a boyish charm. He moved into the cabin, taking the time to nod to some passengers in the frontmost seats of the vessel. Alcock spoke with a rural Yorkshire accent. "Ladies and gents, how do we do? We are good to make go, so if you could be ready." There was a nervous excitement throughout the cabin. Alcock continued, "Could I please ask you, sir, and you, sir?" The pilot gestures to Dukes and the man in front of him, "to move to the right-hand side of the boat, as balance is essential until we are to speed." Mr. Dukes and the other passenger lifted themselves and repositioned to the adjacent row. Dukes decided to take the seat next to Miss Barry. It was the closest free seat. He smiled at the young lady, who reciprocated. Both shuffled with the uncomfortable ease that one experiences when meeting a new travel partner. "For I think we shall be away," continued the boatmaster enthusiastically. The northern accent did not quite marry up to the impeccable presentation of the flying boatmaster uniform. Alcock moved back down the gangway between the rows of seating. Passengers had now fastened their lap belts. Dukes turned to look at Miss Barry, but his view fell beyond and over, and he looked out to sea. The light reflecting off the water made it difficult to achieve perspective. The engines escalated in volume, and the fuselage below groaned as it contains the thrust. Corsair was moving once more. A gull resting on the ocean top offered some vague means of judging acceleration as it moved slowly into view and quickly out. Corsair was gathering pace as if being pulled by some invisible band attached to the horizon, which had suddenly began to recoil from its full extension. Broken wash was being made inaudible by the engine cry, and the speed was quickly becoming dizzying. Spray thrashed against both rows of viewports, and the passengers settled into their chairs in anticipation of impending lift. They were away. The craft lurched and rose like an overweight swan, one moment as if scrabbling for purchase on the continually shifting makeshift runway, the next a bid for freedom as the engine torque finally overcame its mass. Corsair was flying.